Hello, everybody. I'm really happy to slightly croakily introduce Tim Hitchcock, Professor of Digital History at the University of Sussex. Tim is one of the foremost digital historians or digital humanities scholars in the UK and internationally. And he's also a former colleague of mine from the Sussex Humanities Lab, which he's still involved with. And Tim contributes all kinds of things to SHL and to DH generally. I think intellectual heft, brilliance, impatience with jargon, and some fabulous carpentry as well. He's best known internationally, maybe, for the Old Bailey project, which was one of a slew of projects through which he explored and developed a new kind of digitally informed history from below, which you might want to think of as a way of speaking back to intellectual history, or perhaps to speaking to a tradition of DH as literary. So Tim is presenting to us today as part of an in-person visit to Cambridge and CDH as a CDH visiting professor. Obviously that's slightly derailed since we're all on Zoom, but he'll be coming to visit Cambridge for 2 weeks later in the spring. If you want to find out when and join the events, then you'd better join our mailing list. Anyway, so back to today, we've got about an hour and a half. And after the talk, my colleague Siddharth Soni is going to handle questions because my voice isn't persistent. There's lots of people, so make sure you use the raised hands to indicate questions and talks. And you can also use the chat to introduce yourselves or comment all the way through. So Tim's talk is entitled History, the Archive, Persistent Identifiers, and the Knowable Past. So welcome, Tim, and over to you.
Good. Well, thanks very much. And thanks for, well, struggling through COVID to be here and to do the introductions. Thank you for that. The first thing I'd say is that this paper is, I think of as a COVID fever dream. And of course, you know, in the nature of these things, about 3 months ago, I sat down to write it, and I thought I knew exactly what it was going to be about. And then I got about halfway through it and decided that wasn't what it was going to be about. And so one way or another, it is very much me kind of thinking rather than knowing, and very much a experiment for me. On that point, I'm going to share my screen and we'll see if we get that all working. So I want to do just a few things today. First, I want to make a few brief comments about history as a discipline and how the rise of the web and of the digital humanities have affected it or not. And second, I want to contrast that to wider developments in archival and library science through a short kind of history of PIDs, of persistent identifiers. And along the way, first of all, I want to make fun of all the acronyms that are involved, but I also want to explore a bit of that rapidly evolving world of ever more secure systems of connection and identification, what it means for both scholarship and the world of rentier capitalism being built on its foundation. And finally, I want to suggest digital history as a discipline, as a set of practices, can do better than it is at the moment. And that there's a real opportunity to reconceptualize history as a discipline and revalidate it as a methodology for evidencing a knowable past. But first, I want to introduce you to somebody. This is Smuglerius, a plaster cast in the character of the dying gladiator, created in 1834 by William Pink and currently in the collection of the Royal Academy of Art. Smuglerius has his own page on the RA's website and a unique object number, 03//1436, identifying its place in the collection. There's also a Wikipedia page with a permalink. In other words, Smuglerius's present is securely identified and tied to a wider web of linked data online. But the castings Pink used were not new, even in 1834, and have long since disappeared. They had been created by Agostino Carlini some 60 years earlier in 1776. And what Carlini had done was to take the corpse of an executed criminal, hanged at Tyburn, flayed it, and as the body set in rigor mortis, styled it as the dying gladiator, before casting it in plaster of Paris. And the body in question belonged to a man named Thomas Henman, who murdered an excise officer, Joseph Pearson, on the 12th of April, 1776. Henman, in due course, was found guilty at the Old Bailey on the 22nd of May and sentenced to hang and for his body to be dissected. And he duly was. He was executed at Tyburn on the 27th of May, his body taken down and spirited to the Royal Academy, where Carlini set about his gruesome task. And the point about this brief introduction, is that Smuglerius represents a ghostly version of Thomas Henman. To deny the physicality of the casting would be to deny the humanity of Henman, his brutal life and his death. And yet, there are layers and layers of choice, of selection, and of reconfiguration between the human being represented and the figure on the screen. The object number and permalinks perhaps tie down the location of that lump of plaster, but they do not yet tie that physical object to the living body of Thomas Henman. And my belief is that to use Smuglerius as evidence in writing history, that full journey with all its imposed layers of meaning must be accessible. From Henman's first appearance in the manuscript records of London, through the printed proceedings of his trial, to both the records of his corpse's treatment and transformation, and so on through the castings treatment by the Royal Academy, and on to its own capture as a digital object, or perhaps as importantly backwards through all those stages and institutional processes from what we have at the moment to a single human being. Over the next 45 minutes or so, I just want you to keep in mind Thomas Henman and Smuglerius. But overall, having been a historian now for 40 years, my conclusion has been that history is just a weird discipline. And digital history, even more so. It works as a kind of bricolage in which a single, supposedly solid understanding is created by the artful juxtaposition of a variety of forms of evidence. Or to put it differently, it's a kind of heuristic device that seeks to create a good enough version of the past that acts in the present as a naive truth claim. History is frequently defended, and the shelves groan with guides to research methods and historiography. But the field's central practices remain largely indistinguishable from 50 years ago and are incredibly resistant to change. Ironically, both sides of the culture wars appeal to historical truth and have little time for the subtleties of source critique, much less postmodern ambiguity. They believe in the truth of the archive somehow. They believe in the truth of history somehow. And there are exceptions, of course. In media history, issues of authenticity and mediation are debated, and more recently, issues around the nature of born digital sources have attracted some debate. And in literary history, the whole field is apparently at war with itself over just these same issues. But the vast majority of historians, whatever sources they're working with, go through the motions of performing this truth claim by creating a jigsaw of footnotes, quotes, graphs, and tables, and then let these signifiers work in the mind's eye of their readers without much query or question. And the problem is not that history as a genre has ceased to work on the page. It hasn't. But that the truth claim at its heart is built on its relationship to the archive and the library. Each footnote and graph points ineluctably to one or the other. But these memory institutions have not stood still, while history has not evolved methodologically in any substantive way. The libraries and archives have evolved radically and dramatically in the last 30 years. And as a result, it seems to me, history is in danger of losing its foundation. The sign in the footnotes no longer points in the direction of the modern archive and library because they have themselves moved. In part, I believe the explanation for this mismatch, is down to the very success of the World Wide Web. Just as history as a discipline was becoming more self-aware and self-critical in the 1980s and 90s, along came Google with its seductive small search box in a sea of white space. The systems of knowledge that postmodernism had done so much to critique suddenly disappeared into the few milliseconds between pressing the return key and being delivered an impossible number of results. For historians, what came next was what I think of as the great forgetting. Forgetting how libraries worked, forgetting that archives embed power in collections and exclusions, and forgetting that the footnote as a signifier of a research journey was intended to map onto the journey itself. Of course, archival exclusions and bias are at the heart of more recent discussions around decolonization, but the underlying nature of archival holdings as a form of evidence within academic history remain largely unchallenged. We now more often search for the silences in the archive, but those archives remain the foundations of modern historical writing. And what online search has done is eliminate the need to understand the search object and its hierarchies in order to find what you're looking for. And in the process, it seems to me that history as a heuristic device is increasingly unconvincing. Of course, none of this has stopped the production of ever more history. The bibliography of British and Irish history, for example, records 5,101 publications having seen the light of day in 1978, compared to 9,401 40 years later in 2018. And much of this expansion, of course, is down to the collapse of systems of gatekeeping, the commercialization of academic journal publication, falling production costs, and a new rentier capitalism of IT exploitation. But it also suggests that history remains popular as a genre. And that also suggests that my anxiety about the failed relationship between systems of knowledge and the production of history is not shared by many others. Of course, one might have hoped that new methodologies and new approaches would have filled this gap, dragging history into the 21st century. But with few exceptions, this just hasn't happened. Certainly, in my estimation, all the shiny tools of digital humanities just haven't helped. The classic origin myth deployed to explain the evolution of the digital humanities starts with Roberto Busso and progresses via Franco Moretti before getting to Dan Cohen's query, what do we do with 1 million books? And what happened in the process is that the tools the field adopted were chosen to work best with canonical text. Whether it was Roberto Busso's lemmonization of the works of Thomas Aquinas or Franco Moretti's graphs, maps, and trees, the ordering and semantic content of selected text on the page became the object of study for digital humanities. And in general, the most popular tools became those which processed text. Many of these came out of corpus linguistics, including things like AntConc and Voyant tools. But topic modeling and all the associated bag of words approaches, from text frequency to inverse document frequency to n-grams, take as their object of study the flat surface of the page, searching out patterns from endless inherited prose. Even the tools that seem to go beyond that. And one thinks of network analysis and GIS, when applied by digital humanists, have generally been used to map words against geography, or to find patterns between ever more bags of words loosely tied to individuals. For the most part, all these tools work okay in areas of inquiry that are built around a canon, however you define that canon, and have perhaps had their greatest impact on literary studies and its associated disciplines. But for history, there is a problem. The heuristic device that makes history work on the page is the belief that text or objects encode forms of behavior, and that these markers of a semi-knowable past can be reordered to explain change. Its authority is predicated on encoding, through footnotes, a vertical journey into a much larger body of data to text, and from there beyond to an underlying physicality that can be claimed as a story of real behavior in an empirical world. In other words, tools for text mining stop before the last all-important step, from text to a semi-knowable past. In other words, I think history and digital history has a problem. Its practitioners and its wider ecosystem continue to publish books and articles that rely for their authority on the journey into the archive and the library, while our students and a wider reading public have lost the critical knowledge that would have allowed them to assess that research journey. There is a fundamental mismatch here. And perhaps ironically, or perhaps just normally, while history has stayed largely unchanging, in library and archival science, and in the vast majority of STEM, and in fields such as AI and machine learning, and even more in the more interesting parts of the digital humanities itself, change has been overwhelming and radical. While historians have been content to preserve a relationship to the archives and libraries as they were created in the 19th century and survived through the late 20th, archivists and librarians have not. There has been a revolution in how they work that is slowly building into an entirely new context for the preservation and discovery of everything, all of which is informed in part by a critique of how they used to work, a critique of that 19th and 20th century edifice that embedded Western culture in all the systems of discovery and organization. The urge to create a comprehensive model of the world and of human understanding in the form of an ordered library and usable archive can be traced as far back as you like and to whatever part of the globe you like. But in a Western context, it weaves a kind of subtle journey through the works of Linnaeus, Panizzi, Dewey, and Paul Otlet, via the rise of commercial data services, including the University Microfilms, founded in 1938, now ProQuest. But it was only in the latter part of the 20th century that the infrastructure emerged that would allow for this kind of comprehension to really be reached, that it became possible to really imagine a globally comprehensive system for ordering and finding the data of the world. And the aspect of that urge towards comprehension that I want to emphasize today, the development that seems to me to have done the most to change the archive and the library, is the development of a whole raft of persistent identifiers, PIDs. From MARC and WorldCat to TEI via DOIs, ever more precise and subtle encodings of the contents of the world have evolved, driven in part by a utopian vision of an orderly world of transparent knowledge. This has been a generations-long struggle to tie down the object of study, perhaps obfuscated by an impossible number of acronyms. The MARC system, machine-readable cataloging standards, run by OCLC, the Ohio College Library Center, evolved from the 1960s from a long tradition, primarily North American, of creating union catalogs that sought to map one collection against the other. But it was really in the 1980s and 1990s that MARC emerged as a universal format. WorldCat came along in 2003. In publishing, the 1960s creation of ISBNs, International Standard Book Numbers, and ISSNs, International Standard Serial Numbers, was used to, in turn to create the system of DOIs, Digital Object Identifiers, in 1997. 1994 saw the developments of URNs, Unique Resource Names, to provide permanence in a world dominated by more transient URLs, Uniform Resource Locators. And in the same year, HNDLs, handles for identifying objects in distributed information systems, came along. The following year, 1995, saw the creation of PURL, Persistent Uniform Resource Locators. And in 1998, Tim Berners-Lee got in on the act, proposing the creation of cool URIs as a form of PID for web pages. And building on all those, in 2001, John Kuntz and RP Channing Rogers defined ARC standards, Archival Resources Key, with OAIS, Open Archival Information Systems, coming along in 2005. 2009 gifted us ORCIDs, Open Research and Contribution ID, Contributor ID. And 2010 gave us ISNIs, International Standard Name Identifiers. It felt for many decades that you could not go to an international conference without being a working party defining some new set of standards, some new taxonomy, some new system of PIDs. They were everywhere, and everyone seemed to want to be able to grab that space. And of course, all of them were evolving in parallel with the development of linked open data in the context of the semantic web. Now, there were numerous tensions and arguments along the way. Some PIDs have fallen into disuse, while others have thrived. Commercial products such as DOIs have competed for screen space with systems proposed and supported by major research libraries and subject associations. But what happened in those decades was the creation of a whole new ecology of academic reference. In part, these developments were driven by good actors in the archival and library sectors, responding and taking advantage of the affordances of a series of evolving technologies that simply presented themselves. There was a positive and utopian flavor to many of these developments, but they were also hurried along by the imperatives of a changing economy of intellectual property exploitation. Publishers love PIDs. And in the last decade, this transition with its economic implications has, if anything, picked up pace. In 2013, Re3 Data created ROAR to provide unique and persistent IDs for organizations in the research community. And a bit later, the National Research Infrastructure for Australia initiative gifted us RAID, RAID, a research activity identifier for individual projects. And most recently, finally, the TANK initiative towards a national collection includes as one of its foundation projects an extensive work package on persistent identifiers that seeks to transform collection management across Britain's memory institutions in collaboration with partners in Europe and the US. Underpinning much of the recent activity has been the affordances provided by distributed ledger technologies of the sort behind blockchain and cryptocurrencies. These have emerged as a new strategy for identifying heritage material in particular. And as with all things blockchain, these developments come with unbounded tech bro hyperbola. And for all the utopian aspirations of the librarians and archivists, many of these developments were the result of the complex evolving commercial landscape inhabited by publishers, research libraries, and tech companies, and were driven by the ever-growing need to keep track of intellectual property. When copyright was first legislated in Britain in 1710, the Act stipulated that copyright protection should last for 14 years from the date of publication. In the 300 years since, that has crept up to 70 years from the death of the author and could easily last 140 years from the date of publication. And as a result, intellectual property has come to dominate the economy. And PIDs help tie down objects to allow their exploitation. The earliest forms, ISBNs, for example, PIDs facilitated the ordering of books and the allocation of royalties to authors. But since the World Wide Web, they have become central in a new way to systems of value allocation, to a new form of rentier capitalism, where the exploitation of inherited or past IP is used to generate income day in and day out, to rent out, if you like, intellectual property for reuse. The recent spate of high-profile sales of music-backed catalogs is perhaps the best evidence of the effectiveness of PIDs in tracing and exploiting intellectual property. Bob Dylan and Bruce Springsteen have become ever richer because their property is now much easier to locate and monetize via ISRCs and ISMNs, International Standard Recording Codes and International Standard Music Numbers, respectively. And perhaps closer to home, the role PIDs have also had a central role in validating the raw material that goes into the REF, Research Excellence Framework, from citation scores such as H-index to impact donuts. All are part and parcel of a new world of reference and claims to intellectual property that form the foundations of the neoliberal university. They are the ground truth upon which alternative measures of academic value are being built. I think many people in the room this evening, the virtual room this evening, will have been involved in the last REF. The move towards tying things down, making a clear and coherent system where every academic output is somehow findable and judgeable is on the move. PIDs also are just another aspect of the wider process that has given us the joys of non-fungible tokens. A measure of the different kinds of world they facilitate can be found in Elsevier's recent decision to include a unique identifier in the metadata associated with every PDF of every article you download, making it possible for them to trace and charge for copies you share with a friend or a colleague. They claim, of course, that it's about preventing bad actors and stealing their goods. But what it feels like is the beginnings of a new form of reuse. The circulation of knowledge and the community of scholarship facilitated by PIDs is becoming something like just one more streaming service that will make some tech entrepreneur rich. We are going to end up with an academy serviced by Spotify. Now, I'm profoundly uncomfortable with almost all of this. And of course, the humanities disciplines have waged a long battle against the use of metrics for academic assessment. But the rise of PIDs in all their variety has also transformed the nature of the library and the archive. In prospect is the possibility of evidencing the journey of, say, for example, a heritage object through auctions, collections, catalogs, and museums, to, if you like, provide the raw material for a research journey from collection to footnote, to truth claim, and make it a journey that is more secure, more detailed, and more open to criticism than has ever been possible before. And while history and historians have not done much to engage with this transformed system of knowledge, other disciplines have moved towards ever greater research transparency of a sort PIDs seem to facilitate and promise. At least in areas beyond history, tracing and recording the detailed nature of research journeys is becoming ever more standard. In machine learning, one might point to recent proposals to create standardized data sheets for data sets, designed to record the motivation, composition, collection process, recommended use, and so on, of every data set which might be used to create a training set for machine learning. While model cards have recently been taken up by Google as a solution to the ever-fresh accusations of bias in AI, machine learning, and the application of neural networks. These are short documents accompanying trained machine learning models that provide benchmarked evaluation in a variety of conditions, such as across different cultural, demographic, or phenotypic groups and intersectional groups. Between them, these initiatives seek to make transparent what goes into and comes out of the black box, make both explicit and recordable the origins and biases of training data, and the biases and characteristics of the AI models created from them. With the backing of Google, I suspect they will be adopted widely in the data sciences. And even in the more central corridors of that many-storied mansion of the digital humanities, the same direction of travel can be observed in Alan Liu's recent WE1S project, What Everyone Says, which is developing new forms of data stories or data narratives, published again in the form of cards, inspired by documentation methods in medical and nutritional science. Additionally, initiatives such as the new Journal of Digital History being produced by the C2DH in Luxembourg, the Center for Contemporary and Digital History, and the Living with Machines project at the Turing Institute, which uniquely does not have an acronym, suggests serious ways forward via Jupyter notebooks and multi-layered data stacks. Here can be found precisely the same urge to expose the characteristics of both underlying data sets and the contingent nature of data processing. But these are very much exceptions. And what I ask myself is, what are the affordances created by the emerging world of PIDs and data mapping for history in its fullest format? If the textual analytics that form most of DH methodology don't allow the heuristic device that is history to work, to make its undoubtedly problematic claim to knowledge, what about using all those PIDs instead? Can we use them to get to the point where texts in the archive reflect action in the world? In the nature of what librarians and archivists and tech capitalists have built over the last 2 generations, it's now possible to record and contextualize that research journey in a new way. To start with the mark on the paper that left a trace, a record of a physical action, that in turn left a sheet in an archive preserved for a particular purpose, that was then translated into a printed page and hence into a book, and then progressed through endless editions and copyings and so onwards, to the point when it's translated into data on a screen. Rather than assuming a brief footnote is enough to point at the beginning of that journey, historians need to re-engage with the library and archive systems of reference as they now exist. As a result of the hard work of all those archivists and librarians, the information needed is increasingly recorded in consistent formats that allow us to judge their authority and measure their typicality and argue about their quality as evidence of a physical world. In every archival catalog is a record of the provenance, basic content, and place in a collection's hierarchy of each slip of paper. The archivist's note provides thousands of words of detail that places each scrap in its wider context. Now, of course, ordered according to the ISAD, parenthetically G, system, the General International Standard Archival Description, 2nd edition. In the past, it was simply expected that the expert researcher would have in their mind's eye the hierarchical order of the collection, developed by working physically with its volumes and bundles. But in a world where we have hidden the structures of the archive behind keyword searching, that expertise is essentially gone. Explicitly inserting it with every citation would allow it to be more effectively critiqued. In other words, it seems to me that PIDs provide a link from one form of provenance to a usable online version. And similarly, in every book, the colophon, that wonderful and ever more complex collection of data that has evolved from the 16th century onwards, encodes massive amounts of information about origins, authors, publication, all of that. And by extension, through ISBNs and MARC and the OCLC consortium via WorldCat, the place of every book in a profoundly flawed taxonomy of knowing. I mean, if you've ever looked at WorldCat, it is a remarkable system. It allows you to at least attempt, or at least partially, to map where any single book exists in any library globally. It allows you to look at how it has been cataloged within whatever number of systems are used across the globe. It is a comprehensive system that is arguably a map of knowledge across the world. MARC and WorldCat's very claim to universality becomes a way of identifying the biases and maldistribution of knowledge. Between them, it seems to me they form the basis for an explicit and consistent data story, from physical object citation via its institutional setting and repurposing by the researcher, that in turn needs to be an integral part of the evidence used to make history work. And being explicit about these data journeys would have 2 beneficial effects on academic history. First, it would reestablish the basis of the discipline's heuristic device and related truth claim and claim to authority. By reinscribing and making transparent more components of the research journey, the claims to consistent method and clear authority would be substantially bolstered. It would not do the necessary work of then relating text to a knowable world, but it would create the preconditions for that work to be done. And second, it would draw further attention to the limitations and problems of building a narrative and explanation on the basis of inherently selective and biased sources. My colleague and I, Ben Jackson and I, have been working on developing forms of macroscopes that more clearly show the ways in which both archives and libraries are inherently selective and uneven. This started with the Old Bailey Online, and this is simply a scatter plot of the 197,000 trials in the Old Bailey, according to, let's see, this one is punishments. But we've also applied the same methodology to the National Archives Discovery Catalog and the University of Sussex Library Catalog. And what we found in all those instances is a series of overwhelming patterns. Who knew that 75% of the collection in the National Archives is made up of military records? I didn't. It includes exclusions, biases, and endless accretions of layers of historical happenstance. In the Sussex Library, you can see the impact of the Second World War in their collection. And that work was part of the process, is part of the process of trying to delineate exactly how the legacies of empire, purpose, Western state building, and selective survival all shape the object of study. In my mind, it's been an attempt to reconstruct for the online audience and researcher the effect of working in a physical library or a physical archive, where the limits of the collection are shown for all to see, and where the hierarchy of archival collections need to be worked through as a system. But what I'm aiming at for today is something slightly different, which I'm just going to go back to that one because it's a prettier picture. And it's an attempt to ask, given the inevitable problems of coverage and selection inherent in archives and libraries, what can we effectively build on these shifting and uncertain foundations? The idea of expanding data stories to include that full journey from document to secondary literature and incorporating them into how we write history is simply my best hope of highlighting the problems of bias and selection in the archive itself, and to propose a way to make them more credible by exposing the cracks and issues. Essentially, it seems to me, it is only by actually putting front and center the incredible selectiveness of the archives from which we work that we can begin to reconfigure history as a workable project that speaks to everyone. In other words, tying down the research journey would allow us to assess the quality and typicality of the evidence at hand, to expose the limited authority of the archive as a whole. For this audience in particular, I believe this approach challenges the digital humanities to figure out how to reintegrate with older methodologies, how to create forms of analysis and representation that do justice to traditional methodologies like history, while taking advantage of the affordances of the digital. Historians are not corpus linguists, and their object of study is not text. It's a problematic but knowable past, accessible via the analysis of inherited text, object, and landscape. Seems to me that history and the digital humanities will be useful when our tools are consistent with our methodology and designed in light of it. And finally, I want to go back to Thomas Henman and Smuglerius, including, as a matter of course, all the details of that journey from Smuglerius back to a breathing human being, allows that pile of plaster, because that's all it is, to do a different kind of work in the present. Thanks very much.